Tonight, I want to share something that many people never notice. Not because it is impossible to see, but because avoidant people become very skilled at acting as if it does not exist. I want to explain why many avoidant individuals quietly begin falling apart inside after they finally push an empath into silence. Here is the surprising part. The exact moment they believe they have won the emotional battle is often the same moment something deep inside them begins to break. Stay with me, because what happens next changes the entire picture. Avoidants and empaths often seem like complete opposites. One person experiences emotions with incredible intensity. The other quickly hides every feeling the moment it appears. One naturally moves closer to build connection. The other steps back to protect themselves from vulnerability. In the beginning, this difference can feel comforting, almost like two puzzle pieces fitting together, but little by little that balance fades. What once felt peaceful slowly becomes an invisible struggle. The empath keeps giving. They keep listening, forgiving, understanding, and believing love can reach beyond fear. Meanwhile, the avoidant continues creating distance. They withdraw, resist, protect themselves, and quietly build emotional walls one brick at a time. The real shift begins the moment the empath stops giving away endless emotional energy. That is when the foundation underneath the relationship starts changing. Everything the avoidant believed they were controlling was actually being supported by a pattern they never truly understood. Keep watching, because this is where the hidden emotional story begins to unfold. Many people believe avoidants are experts at handling relationships. In reality, they often become experts at avoiding uncomfortable emotions. The relationship appears stable because someone else is carrying most of the emotional weight. That person is usually the empath. Their patience becomes the cushion. Their forgiveness softens every painful moment. Their constant emotional effort quietly protects the avoidant from experiencing the full impact of their own distance. As long as the empath continues giving, the avoidant rarely has to stop and examine what their emotional walls are costing them. They never have to face the loneliness hidden underneath the surface. They never have to look closely at old wounds, unmet needs, or fears they buried years ago. Those painful places remain locked away because someone else keeps filling the emotional space. Without realizing it, the empath becomes the emotional support system holding everything together. The avoidant may believe they are staying in control, but often they are simply depending on someone else's strength while remaining disconnected from their own emotions. It is a quiet pattern that can continue for months or even years without either person fully understanding what is happening beneath the surface. And what happens when that emotional support suddenly disappears may surprise you more than you expect. For many avoidants, an empath's love quietly works like emotional oxygen. They may never admit it openly, and in many cases they may not even recognize it themselves. But that steady love helps them feel stable. It allows them to feel accepted without exposing their deepest fears. It gives reassurance without requiring complete emotional openness. It lets them feel valued even when they struggle to return that same emotional presence. The empath is not simply offering love. They are creating safety through endless patience, understanding, and consistency. Over time, the avoidant begins treating that comfort as something permanent. They assume the empath will always remain available. They believe the connection will continue no matter how often they pull away. Somewhere deep inside, they begin thinking there will always be another chance later. More time to explain, more time to reconnect, more time to return after another period of distance. Because every previous withdrawal eventually ended with the empath reaching back again, they slowly convince themselves this pattern will never change. They stop noticing how much emotional energy the other person is spending just to keep the relationship alive. They mistake endless patience for endless supply. And that quiet misunderstanding becomes the beginning of everything that follows. Do not miss the next part, because this is where everything quietly turns upside down. Then something unexpected happens. The empath becomes quiet, not because they are trying to punish anyone, not because they suddenly stopped caring. Their silence grows out of exhaustion rather than anger. It is the kind of silence that quietly says, "I cannot keep carrying both of us anymore." There are no dramatic speeches, no emotional explosions, no desperate attempts to force change, only stillness. At first, the avoidant hardly notices the difference. They assume it is another temporary pause, just like before. They tell themselves the empath simply needs a little space and everything will soon return to normal. After all, that has happened many times in the past. But this time is different in a way they cannot immediately explain. The messages no longer arrive with the same warmth. The emotional rescue never comes. The familiar reassurance slowly disappears. The silence remains. Day after day, nothing changes. That is when something unfamiliar begins happening inside the avoidant. The emotional distance they once controlled suddenly feels different because it is no longer happening on their terms. And without realizing it, they begin facing the very emotions they spent years trying to escape. The silence they once believed protected them slowly becomes the mirror they can no longer avoid. If you have ever wondered why this stage changes everything, keep listening, because the next chapter reveals what most people never see. At first, they simply wait. They expect the familiar warmth to return, believing the silence is only temporary, just another pause before everything slips back into its usual rhythm. But as the quiet continues, something strange begins growing inside them. It is a feeling they cannot easily explain or even name. A quiet instability slowly settles in. The emotional ground they had been standing on without realizing it starts moving beneath their feet. The inner balance they believed belonged to them was actually being supported by someone else's steady presence all along. And once that support disappears, everything begins to shake. This is where the real collapse quietly begins. Not in dramatic conversations, not through emotional outbursts. It happens deep inside where nobody else can see. For years, many avoidant people convince themselves their greatest strength comes from creating distance. They feel secure when they pull away. They feel protected when they hide their emotions. They believe they are strongest when nothing seems to affect them. But once the empath's voice fades into silence, that feeling of safety slowly transforms into loneliness. The space they once called protection begins feeling empty. The distance that once acted like armor slowly becomes a hollow place they can no longer escape. Keep watching, because this quiet shift reveals something most people never notice until it is far too late. For the first time, there is nobody left carrying the emotional weight they quietly depended on. The empath's love is no longer softening their fears. Their endless patience is no longer smoothing over moments of emotional distance. Their constant effort is no longer filling the invisible cracks that had been growing for years. Suddenly, the avoidant is left alone with everything they spent so much time trying not to feel. Old wounds begin rising to the surface. Quiet insecurities become impossible to ignore. Long-buried pain slowly returns. Emotional emptiness, fear of closeness, fear of rejection, and fear of abandonment all begin asking for attention at the same time. Every feeling they push down in the name of independence starts finding its way back into the light. The emotional walls that once looked so strong begin showing signs of weakness. Small cracks appear first, then larger ones follow. None of it happens overnight. It unfolds slowly, almost silently, until the weight of years without emotional healing becomes impossible to carry alone. If you have ever wondered why some people suddenly change after losing someone who always stayed, this is where that answer quietly begins. This kind of collapse rarely announces itself with dramatic scenes. It arrives little by little. In the silence, they begin noticing the absence of someone they once assumed would always be there. They start missing a warmth they used to describe as overwhelming. They feel themselves drawn toward a connection they insisted they never really needed. Regret slowly enters because silence has a way of uncovering truths people spend years avoiding. They once believed love would always wait. They believed they controlled the emotional distance. They believed they could continue walking away without consequences. Now they find themselves facing the reality they never expected. The emotional bill they ignored for years has finally arrived. They are no longer able to hand their emotional burden to someone else. Instead, they must sit with themselves, listening to thoughts they spent years trying to outrun. The silence they once depended on for protection slowly becomes a mirror, reflecting everything they refused to face. They finally begin understanding that the empath's emotional energy was never simply extra kindness. It was quietly supporting the relationship every single day. Without it, the full weight of everything they avoided comes crashing down all at once. Stay with me, because the next part explains why silence suddenly loses its power. This story is not only about losing another person, it is also about losing the invisible emotional structure someone else had been maintaining all along. It is about losing the feeling of being wanted without having to ask. It is about losing the quiet comfort of knowing someone would always reach back first. Once that support disappears, the avoidant's inner world begins shifting in ways they never imagined. For the first time, they are forced to experience emotions they spent years running away from. Many avoidant people believe silence is strength until the other person becomes silent too. For them, silence has always been a form of protection. It helps calm overwhelming emotions. It creates distance whenever vulnerability feels dangerous. It gives them the illusion of control when emotional closeness feels overwhelming. Most of the time, they do not disappear to punish anyone. They disappear because retreat feels safer than staying emotionally exposed. Silence becomes their shelter, their escape, and their way of calming an overloaded nervous system. As long as they control the distance, they believe they remain emotionally safe. But what happens when someone else chooses the same silence changes everything. And that is exactly where this hidden emotional pattern begins falling apart. For a long time, that strategy appears successful because the empath quietly fills every empty space silence creates. They send the first message, they offer reassurance, they soften difficult moments, they rebuild connection after every withdrawal. Again and again, every retreat is answered with another act of patience. Every silent period is met with more understanding, more kindness, and more emotional effort. Because the empath keeps responding to emptiness with love, the avoidant slowly begins believing silence costs nothing. They convince themselves their distance makes them strong. They assume someone will always return to repair whatever emotional gap they leave behind. Then one day, something happens they never expected. The empath becomes silent too, not because love disappeared, not because they wanted revenge. They become quiet because their emotional strength has finally been exhausted. Empaths rarely choose silence quickly. They usually reach that point only after trying everything they know. They become quiet when they realize their words are no longer reaching the other person's heart. They stop speaking because repeating the same love into the same silence no longer changes anything. And that quiet decision often becomes the moment everything inside the avoidant finally begins to shift. If you have stayed this far, the next part may completely change how you understand emotional distance forever. They become quiet when loving someone begins to feel more like losing themselves than growing together. There comes a point where every conversation feels heavy, every attempt feels unanswered, and every act of love seems to disappear into silence. That is usually when the empath finally stops reaching out. And when that moment arrives, everything the avoidant believed about emotional strength starts falling apart. The silence that once felt comforting suddenly becomes unsettling. It no longer feels like protection. It begins to feel like loss. The same quiet that once helped them escape difficult emotions now sits heavily on their heart. For the first time, they experience something they spent years avoiding: real emotional panic. This silence is not empty. It carries meaning. It carries boundaries. It quietly says, "I cannot keep chasing anymore." It says, "I gave everything I had." It says, "The distance is no longer your choice alone." And slowly the avoidant begins seeing something they never wanted to admit. The silence they relied on was not always strength. Much of the time it was fear hidden behind emotional distance. Keep watching, because this is where the emotional picture changes in a way most people never expect. Without realizing it, they had been depending on the empath's willingness to keep trying. They leaned on endless forgiveness. They counted on patience that seemed impossible to run out. They quietly relied on someone else's emotional endurance to keep the relationship standing. But once the empath becomes silent, that invisible support disappears. There is no cushion left, no one gently balancing the relationship from the other side. Suddenly, their own silence becomes a mirror instead of a shield. And the reflection is uncomfortable. They begin facing a truth they spent years avoiding. They never truly mastered emotional distance. They simply had someone else closing the gap every time they stepped away. Without that steady warmth filling the empty spaces, without the constant reassurance and quiet affection, they are left feeling exposed. Emotions they buried for years begin rising one after another. Loneliness, doubt, longing, regret. Feelings they believed they had escaped quietly return. The silence now feels louder than every argument they avoided, louder than every conversation they walked away from, louder than every emotion they locked behind invisible walls. Stay with me, Because the next part explains why this silence becomes impossible to ignore. The reason this silence feels so overwhelming is simple. This time they did not choose it. They know how to manage their own withdrawal because it has become familiar, but they struggle when someone else chooses distance instead. That sudden loss of control touches one of their deepest fears, the fear of losing someone who mattered far more than they ever admitted, sometimes even to themselves. For years they convinced themselves that silence made them powerful, but when the empath becomes silent too, that story completely changes. The real strength was never found in the person stepping away. It was quietly living inside the person who kept showing up, kept loving, kept speaking honestly, and kept trying despite repeated disappointment. True strength was never built through emotional walls. It grew through vulnerability, patience, and courage. Once the empath stops reaching back, the avoidant is forced to recognize something painful. Their silence did not protect the relationship. Little by little, it weakened it. The emotional armor they trusted for so long slowly becomes the very thing causing them pain. And that realization often becomes one of the hardest emotional lessons they will ever face. Do not click away, because the deepest part of this journey is only beginning. The real collapse often begins the moment they understand that silence was never true power, especially when it comes from the one person who loved them with consistency. Now the quiet feels different. It feels like loss, except this time it is their own loss to carry. That silence opens a battle they spent their entire life avoiding. The battle inside themselves. Many avoidant people build their emotional habits around escaping discomfort. Whenever emotions become too intense, they shut down, they disconnect, they create distance. They convince themselves that pulling away is the safest choice. These habits rarely appear without reason. They are often shaped by early experiences, emotional wounds, and years of learning that vulnerability feels unsafe. Because of this, they continue running from the parts of themselves that feel painful or unfamiliar. Looking inward feels overwhelming, almost like stepping into a fire they believe they cannot survive. As long as someone else keeps the emotional connection alive, they never have to face what is waiting underneath those defenses. But once that outside support disappears, everything changes, and that is when the quiet becomes impossible to escape. While the empath kept explaining, loving, forgiving, and carrying the relationship with remarkable patience, the avoidant rarely needed to examine the fear hiding beneath their emotional distance. They could continue avoiding difficult questions. They could blame circumstances, create explanations, or convince themselves everything was fine because someone else kept rebuilding what was falling apart. But once that familiar voice disappears, the entire emotional landscape changes. There is no one left to hide behind. No emotional conversation distracting them, no reassuring presence softening the consequences of their withdrawal. The explanations stop, the comfort fades, the endless forgiveness quietly comes to an end. Without that steady reflection beside them, they are pushed into a conversation they never wanted to have, a conversation with themselves. They begin facing fears they buried years ago, insecurities they constantly outran, pain they refused to acknowledge. Slowly they realized they were never as emotionally detached as they believed. The distance had become a performance, not complete freedom. Many avoidant people fear what they might discover inside themselves even more than they fear losing a relationship. That is often why they disconnect the moment emotions become deeply real. Looking inward means facing old beliefs that they were never fully loved, never completely safe, never enough. It means confronting the fear that closeness always leads to pain, and that vulnerability always ends in rejection. As long as the empath remained patient, warm, and emotionally present, those fears stayed hidden behind borrowed safety. But true silence removes every shield. It fills the room with light and quietly reveals how fragile that borrowed strength always was. If this perspective resonates with you, stay until the end, because the final piece brings everything together. The quiet forces them to face every feeling they spent years trying to escape. In the stillness, emotions begin rising one after another: fear, loneliness, guilt, longing, regret, confusion, old abandonment wounds they never fully admitted to themselves. Everything seems to arrive at the same time because they never learned how to process emotions little by little. Instead, many of those feelings stayed buried beneath years of emotional distance. For a long time, the empath carried much of the emotional weight. They helped steady the relationship, eased difficult moments, and quietly held things together through patience and understanding. But now that familiar voice has faded. The avoidant suddenly finds themselves overwhelmed by emotions they no longer know how to avoid. The silence becomes a mirror, reflecting their own choices back at them. It reflects the distance they created, the emotional coldness they believed kept them safe, the hurt that slowly built between two people, yet the deepest realization cuts even further. They begin understanding they may have pushed away the one person who genuinely accepted them, understood them, and cared for them without asking them to become someone else. Stay with me, because the next part explains why this realization often arrives long after the relationship has changed. Many avoidant people do not always express emotions openly, but that does not mean those emotions disappear. Instead, they often build quietly beneath the surface until one day they arrive all at once. After the empath becomes silent, many of the coping habits that once felt reliable begin losing their power. Ignoring emotions no longer works. Constant distractions no longer cover the emptiness. Logical explanations stop bringing comfort. There is no longer another person expressing endless emotions they can point toward instead of looking inward. They can no longer say they simply need more space because the space now feels painfully empty. They can no longer describe it as independence because it begins feeling more like isolation. Slowly, a difficult truth starts becoming impossible to ignore. They were not only avoiding another person, they were avoiding their own vulnerability, and now there is nowhere left to run from it. The calm image they carefully maintained begins cracking, revealing emotional struggles that had always been hidden underneath. It becomes clear how much fear quietly shaped their choices, and how many opportunities for genuine closeness slipped away because they never felt emotionally safe enough to receive love fully. Keep watching, because this is where everything becomes deeply personal. The real emotional reckoning rarely arrives through dramatic arguments or emotional scenes. It happens in silence, alone with thoughts they can no longer escape. Guilt begins speaking, regret quietly follows, fear returns. Long-forgotten emotional needs begin asking for attention. For someone who built their identity around avoiding emotional discomfort, this inner confrontation feels overwhelming. It can feel as though the ground beneath them has suddenly shifted. For perhaps the first time, they begin realizing that the empath's love had quietly become an emotional anchor. It helped steady them in ways they never fully recognized while it was still there. They may never have spoken those words aloud, but the support existed all the same. Now that anchor is gone. Without it, they are left facing emotions they postponed for years. That is why the empath's silence often becomes such a powerful turning point. It removes more than conversation. It removes excuses. There is no longer anyone absorbing the emotional weight or softening every difficult moment. Once those familiar patterns disappear, the only place left to look is inward. And for many avoidant people, that inward journey is the hardest one they have ever faced. Do not click away, because the next shift reveals something most people completely overlook. Many avoidant people quietly expect relationships to follow a familiar emotional pattern. Distance is created, someone reaches back, reassurance returns, connection is restored without requiring deep vulnerability. Over time, this rhythm begins feeling normal. They expect understanding, they expect patience, they expect forgiveness, not because they consciously plan it, but because it has become the emotional script they know best. Being pursued allows them to feel valued without exposing their deepest fears. So whenever they create distance, they unconsciously expect the empath to bridge the gap again. They expect heartfelt conversations, careful explanations, emotional attempts to repair the connection. That repeating cycle quietly becomes the foundation supporting the relationship. It allows love to continue even when emotional effort remains one-sided. But eventually something changes. The empath stops chasing. There are no desperate messages, no endless explanations, no emotional rescue arriving to fill the silence. Instead, there is only calm, peaceful, steady, quiet. And that quiet carries a message many avoidant people never expected to hear. It quietly says, "I have accepted what I cannot change." If you are still listening, the final piece may completely change how you see emotional distance. That peaceful silence often feels more unsettling than any argument ever could. Arguments still suggest that someone cares enough to fight. Tears suggest the connection still matters. Questions show someone remains emotionally invested. Being pursued quietly confirms they are still important to another person's heart. But genuine peace tells a different story. It signals that something inside the empath has changed. They are no longer trying to revive what kept hurting them. They are no longer depending on the avoidant for their emotional stability. And that realization can shake the avoidant more deeply than they expected. It challenges the quiet belief that someone will always keep reaching back. Beneath that realization often lives an old fear, the fear that without someone chasing them, they may no longer feel chosen. The silence reveals how much emotional meaning the empath had quietly been providing all along. It shows that the confidence they believed belonged entirely to them was often strengthened by another person's patience, love, and resilience. Once that steady presence is gone, they begin realizing that much of the emotional security they relied on had been supported from the other side of the relationship. And sometimes that understanding becomes the beginning of the deepest personal change they have ever faced. If this perspective gave you a new way of seeing these relationship patterns, stay until the end because the final chapter brings everything together. Once that support disappears, the emotional picture changes completely. The confidence they quietly leaned on begins to crack, and the image they built of themselves becomes much harder to hold together. Peace leaves them with nowhere to hide. There is no noise to distract them, no conflict to point at, no emotional chase to fall back on, no familiar cycle keeping uncomfortable feelings buried. In that stillness, they finally face a truth they spent years avoiding. They are standing alone, not because the empath suddenly stopped loving them, but because they never truly learned how to remain emotionally present when love asked them to stay. When that realization slowly settles in, the deeper emotional collapse begins. Many avoidant people discover too late that silence does not simply remove another person's voice. It removes every excuse they once depended on. They begin seeing how much fear quietly shaped every decision.